The most terrifying thing my father ever said to me was not a threat, but a reminder. He looked at me calmly and told me that if people ever knew the truth about me, my life would be over. Not because I was a bad person, but because reputation decides who deserves mercy. In that moment, I understood that my future was no longer mine. It was something he could destroy whenever he wanted. Growing up, my father was obsessed with appearances. He taught me that a woman's value lives and dies by what people say about her. He talked about honor, respect, and image as if they were sacred laws. I thought he was preparing me for the world. I didn't realize he was teaching me how easily I could be controlled by fear. To everyone else, he was admired. Calm, intelligent, well-respected, the kind of man people trusted instantly. Relatives praised him, neighbors sought his advice, and people constantly told me how lucky I was to have such a caring father. That reputation protected him, and it trapped me. Because when someone like that speaks, people listen. And when someone like me speaks, they question. The first secret he held over me came from a moment of weakness. I was young, scared, and trusted him completely. I told him something deeply personal, believing that fathers are meant to protect their daughters from the world. He didn't react with anger or disappointment. He listened quietly and told me how dangerous it would be if anyone else ever found out. I mistook that warning for love. As I got older, those warnings became reminders. Every time I disagreed with him, every time I tried to assert myself, he would calmly bring up my reputation. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. He just explained how easily people turn away from women once a story spreads. He knew exactly how society would judge me, and he used that knowledge like a weapon. When I finally told him I wanted independence, he didn't argue. He smiled and asked me if I was ready to lose everything. He named the people who would stop speaking to me, the opportunities that would disappear, the labels that would follow me forever. He said it so casually that my body went cold. That was the moment I realized he wasn't protecting my reputation. He was holding it hostage. From that day on, my life became a performance. I watched every word I said, every choice I made, every step I took, not because I was ashamed, but because I was terrified of becoming the version of myself he threatened to reveal. I wasn't living carefully out of pride. I was surviving. The most disturbing truth was this: he didn't need to lie about me. He didn't need to exaggerate. All he needed was silence, fear, and the knowledge that people would always believe him before they believed me. And as long as that was true, he knew he owned my future. What I didn't know yet was that fear can only control someone for so long. And the day he pushed too far, he forced me to make a decision that would either destroy my reputation forever or finally take away the power he thought he had over me. After that moment, fear stopped being a reaction and became a routine. I woke up with it, carried it through the day, and fell asleep with it sitting heavy in my chest. Even when my father wasn't around, his presence shaped my choices. I thought about what I said, how I said it, and who might hear it, because every word felt like a potential mistake I couldn't afford. He didn't need to remind me often. Every few weeks, sometimes even months apart, he would casually bring it up again, always at moments when I felt confident or hopeful. If I mentioned a new job opportunity, he would smile and ask whether I was sure I wanted that much attention. If I talked about traveling or meeting new people, he would quietly mention how fast rumors spread when lives changed too quickly. He never framed it as a threat. He framed it as concern. Slowly, my world began to shrink. I stopped sharing personal things with friends because I was afraid of letting something slip. I turned down opportunities that excited me because they felt risky. I avoided social situations where questions might come up. It wasn't that he was constantly controlling me. It was worse. He had trained me to control myself. At family gatherings, he played his role perfectly. Proud, attentive, supportive. People praised him openly and told me how lucky I was to have such a protective father. I smiled and agreed because explaining the truth felt impossible. How do you tell people that the man they admire is quietly holding your future hostage? How do you explain abuse that leaves no bruises and makes no noise? There were nights when I tried to convince myself I was exaggerating, that maybe this was just strict parenting taken too far. But then I would remember the calm certainty in his voice when he talked about my reputation, the way he never doubted his power, the way he knew exactly how society would judge me if he spoke. Those thoughts always brought the fear back. The pressure began affecting my body. I struggled to sleep. My thoughts raced constantly. I felt tense even in moments that were supposed to be peaceful. I realized I wasn't just afraid of him anymore. I was afraid of being seen, afraid of being known, afraid of becoming visible in a world that might turn against me if one story changed. What hurt the most was realizing that even if he never acted on his threat, the damage was already done. My choices were no longer mine. They were reactions to fear. I wasn't living a life I wanted. I was maintaining a life that felt safe enough to survive. And then, for the first time, something unexpected happened. During one of his reminders, I noticed a hesitation in his voice, just a brief pause, almost unnoticeable, but enough to make me wonder. That pause planted a dangerous thought in my mind, a question I had never allowed myself to ask before. What if his power wasn't as absolute as he wanted me to believe? That thought terrified me more than the threat itself, because once it existed, I couldn't erase it. And without realizing it yet, that single doubt was the beginning of everything unraveling. That doubt stayed with me, even when I tried to push it away. Once I noticed the hesitation in his voice, I started noticing other things too. The way he avoided specifics when he talked about what he could do to me. The way his warnings were always vague, never detailed. He spoke with confidence, but I began to wonder whether that confidence came from certainty or from knowing how afraid I was. I didn't confront him. I wasn't brave enough for that yet. Instead, I tested the edges quietly. I delayed answering his questions. I shared less about my life. I made small decisions without telling him first and waited for the consequences. Every time my body braced for impact, but nothing happened. No exposure, no rumors, no sudden collapse of my life. He noticed the changes immediately. His reminders became more frequent, more carefully timed. He would bring them up when we were alone, always calmly, always with that same controlled tone. But something had shifted. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with curiosity. I started wondering how much of my prison was built by his threats and how much was built by my belief in them. At the same time, the emotional weight became unbearable. Living under constant surveillance had taught me to doubt myself. I questioned every instinct, every desire, every plan. Even moments of happiness felt temporary, like they could be taken away at any second. I realized I wasn't just afraid of losing my reputation. I was afraid of losing my identity entirely. I began writing things down, not because I knew what I would do with them, but because I needed proof that this was real. I documented conversations, dates, the exact words he used when he reminded me of my past. Seeing it written made it harder to excuse his behavior or minimize my own fear. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't protection. This was control. The most painful realization came when I understood why it worked for so long. He wasn't holding my reputation hostage because he hated me. He was doing it because he needed to feel powerful, respected, necessary. As long as I depended on his silence, he felt important in my life. Letting go of control would mean facing his own emptiness, and he wasn't ready for that. I reached out to someone I trusted carefully, without details, just enough to see if my voice still mattered. Even that small step felt dangerous, but instead of judgment, I was met with concern. Real concern. For the first time I felt seen, and that scared me almost as much as it gave me hope. From that moment on, I knew something had changed. Whether I stayed or left, something was going to break. The only question was whether it would be my future or the control he had built around my fear. And as I quietly prepared for what came next, I had no idea how aggressively he would react once he realized he was losing his grip. By that point, I was living two completely different lives. In public, I was careful, polite, composed, exactly the kind of person my father wanted others to see. In private, I was constantly tense, replaying conversations in my head, questioning whether I had said too much or revealed something dangerous. I learned how to smile while feeling completely hollow inside. He continued playing his role flawlessly. In front of others, he spoke proudly about me, praised my discipline, my maturity, my choices. People admired our relationship and often commented on how close we seemed. Hearing that felt suffocating because I knew how much of that closeness was built on fear rather than trust. At home, the reminders continued, subtle but persistent. He would mention how fragile reputations are, how quickly respect disappears once doubt enters people's minds. Sometimes he framed it as advice, sometimes as concern, but the message was always the same. I was safe only as long as I stayed exactly where he wanted me. The emotional weight of that control began to break me down. I felt exhausted all the time, even when I hadn't done anything. My body stayed tense, as if I were constantly preparing for something bad to happen. I started losing confidence in my own thoughts, second-guessing instincts I once trusted. Fear had become the background noise of my life. I realized how isolated I had become when I noticed I no longer knew who I could speak to honestly. Every conversation felt filtered, every friendship felt distant. I wasn't just hiding from the world, I was disappearing inside myself. And the more invisible I became, the easier it was for him to maintain control. There were moments when anger surfaced, brief flashes where I wanted to confront him and end everything at once. But anger quickly gave way to fear. I knew that a single wrong move could trigger consequences I wasn't ready to face. That fear kept me quiet, even as it slowly consumed me. What scared me most was how normal it all started to feel. The constant vigilance, the self-censorship, the quiet compliance. I worried that this version of my life might become permanent, that I would wake up one day years later and realize I had never truly lived. That was when I understood something important. Surviving like this was not the same as living, and if I didn't change something soon, the cost of staying silent would be greater than the cost of facing whatever came next. That realization didn't give me courage yet, but it gave me urgency. Without knowing exactly how or when, I started preparing myself mentally for the moment I would have to stop playing my role. I didn't know what the confrontation would look like. I only knew that continuing this double life was slowly destroying me, and that fear was no longer enough to keep me here. The fallout didn't come all at once. It came slowly, in quiet moments where I realized his control was no longer absolute. He still tried to hold my reputation over me, but something had changed in the way he spoke. The certainty was gone. His reminders sounded rehearsed now, less confident, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. I began pulling away in ways that couldn't be undone. I shared less, visited less, explained nothing. Distance became my first real boundary. He noticed immediately and reacted the only way he knew how, by tightening his grip. He warned me again about consequences, about how people would turn on me if the truth came out, but this time his words didn't land the same way. Fear was still there, but it no longer owned me. What surprised me most was how the world didn't collapse the way he promised it would. I made small moves toward independence, expecting disaster at every step, but nothing happened. People didn't abandon me. Opportunities didn't disappear overnight. Life continued, imperfect but intact. Each normal day weakened the power he claimed to have over me. That's when he escalated. He began reaching out to others, dropping vague hints, planting seeds of doubt about my stability and my choices. He never said anything directly damaging, just enough to remind me that he could. Instead of panicking, I paid attention. I noticed how carefully he avoided specifics, how he tested reactions before saying more. It became clear that he was afraid of going too far. The truth finally settled in. He wasn't protecting my reputation anymore, because exposing it would expose him too. The image he had built for himself depended on my silence, just as much as my future once depended on his. We were tied together by the same secret, and for the first time, the balance wasn't entirely in his favor. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. I understood that staying meant living in a permanent standoff, a life defined by fear and restraint. Leaving meant uncertainty, but it also meant honesty, choice, and the chance to rebuild myself without permission. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't ask for understanding. I simply stopped playing my role. I chose distance over confrontation, truth over appearances, and freedom over fear. His control didn't vanish overnight, but it weakened every time I refused to react the way he expected me to. For the first time, my reputation felt like something I could own again, not because it was perfect, but because it was mine. And even though the consequences were still unfolding, I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever happened next, it would no longer be decided by him. Once I stopped reacting the way he expected, the situation changed in ways I wasn't prepared for. He became more unpredictable, less controlled. The calm authority he relied on started slipping, and in its place appeared something sharper and more desperate. He wasn't used to losing leverage, and it showed. Small things started happening around me. People asked strange questions. Conversations felt slightly off. I could tell he had been speaking to others, shaping narratives carefully, never outright accusing me, just implying concern. He wanted to remind me that my reputation was still fragile, that he could still influence how people saw me. Instead of panicking, I watched closely. For the first time, I wasn't frozen by fear. I was alert. What hurt the most was realizing how easily doubt spreads. Some people looked at me differently, not hostile, just uncertain. That uncertainty was enough to make my chest tighten. It brought back every fear he had planted in me. I questioned whether leaving had been a mistake, whether silence would have been safer, but I also noticed something new. The damage wasn't as immediate or absolute as he had promised all those years. He confronted me shortly after. Not with anger, but with frustration he struggled to hide. He accused me of being ungrateful, of destroying the family, of turning my back on everything he had done for me. He said I was forcing his hand, that I was leaving him with no choice. Hearing that made something inside me snap. For the first time, I recognized the pattern clearly. This wasn't protection. This was punishment. I told him calmly that I wasn't afraid anymore. The words felt unreal coming out of my mouth. He stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language. He tried to remind me of the consequences again, but his voice lacked conviction. I realized then that fear had been doing his work for him all along. Without it, he had nothing left to threaten me with. That moment didn't feel victorious. It felt terrifying and freeing at the same time. I walked away shaking, unsure of what he would do next, but certain of one thing: whatever came after this, it would be real, not controlled, not rehearsed, just consequences, faced honestly. In the days that followed, the tension lingered. The fallout wasn't explosive, but it was exhausting. I had to sit with uncertainty, with judgment, with the possibility that some people would never fully understand my side. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in years. Agency, the ability to choose how I responded instead of reacting out of fear. I didn't know yet how the story would end. I only knew that I had crossed a point of no return, and whether the cost was high or low, I was finally willing to pay it if it meant never handing my life back to him again. As time passed, I began to see the real cost of what he had done, not just to me, but to himself. Without my fear to sustain him, his authority felt hollow. The image he worked so hard to protect started cracking in small, quiet ways. People noticed inconsistencies. Questions were asked. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just enough doubt to weaken the certainty he depended on. Some relationships changed permanently. A few people kept their distance, unsure of what to believe, and I learned to accept that not everyone would understand my choices. Others surprised me with their support, not loudly or publicly, but in quiet conversations where they admitted they had sensed something was wrong for a long time. Those moments didn't erase the past, but they reminded me I wasn't as alone as I had once believed. My father's behavior shifted again. He became withdrawn, defensive, careful with his words. The confidence he once carried so easily was gone, replaced by irritation and denial. He never admitted what he had done. He never apologized. Instead, he framed himself as the victim, someone who had been misunderstood and abandoned. I realized then that accountability was something he was never going to offer. Emotionally, I was exhausted. Freedom didn't feel light or joyful right away. It felt heavy, like learning how to walk again after years of being held still. I had to relearn how to trust my instincts, how to speak without rehearsing, how to exist without bracing for punishment. Healing wasn't dramatic, it was slow, uncomfortable, and deeply personal. There were moments of grief too. Grief for the father I wished I had, grief for the years spent shrinking myself to survive, grief for the version of me that learned fear before confidence. Letting go of control also meant letting go of the hope that he would ever become the parent I needed. What surprised me most was the quiet sense of peace that followed, not happiness, not relief, but steadiness. My reputation no longer felt like a weapon aimed at my back. It felt imperfect, human, and real. I could live with that. I could own that. I understood then that his power had never been as strong as it felt. It only worked because I believed in it. Once that belief was gone, all that remained was a man afraid of losing control and a daughter who no longer needed his permission to exist. I didn't know exactly what my future would look like, but for the first time it felt open instead of fragile. And that was enough to keep moving forward. With distance came clarity, not the kind that rewrites the past or softens it, but the kind that lets you see it without flinching. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped imagining what I should have said or how I could have behaved differently. I finally understood that nothing I did created the situation I was trapped in. Fear didn't start with me, and it wasn't mine to carry forever. Life didn't suddenly become easy. There were consequences I had to accept, awkward explanations, unanswered questions, and relationships that never fully recovered. But those consequences felt honest. They belonged to my choices, not to someone else's control. For the first time, I was living with outcomes instead of threats, and that difference mattered more than I expected. My father and I became strangers, in the quietest way possible. There was no final argument, no dramatic closure, no apology, just distance maintained by necessity. I stopped waiting for him to understand, because I realized understanding was never the point. Control was. And once control was gone, there was nothing left for us to negotiate. I learned that reputation is not something you protect by hiding, it's something you survive by owning. The version of me he threatened to expose no longer scared me because it was incomplete, frozen in time, stripped of growth and context. The truth of who I was had expanded beyond his story, and that truth was stronger than fear. What stayed with me the most was this realization. Control only works in silence. It needs secrecy, obedience, and isolation to survive. The moment you name it, question it, or step away from it, it begins to weaken. Freedom doesn't arrive loudly, it arrives quietly, in the moment you stop asking permission to exist. I don't tell this story to seek sympathy or to punish anyone. I tell it because there are people living inside similar cages, convinced they are alone, convinced they deserve it, convinced that fear is the price of belonging. It isn't. No love that demands silence is worth keeping. This was the end of his control over my reputation, but it was the beginning of my ownership of my life. Whatever my future holds, it will be built on truth instead of fear. And that, for the first time, feels like enough. What you have just heard is not only the end of a story, it is a judgment. It is the judgment of the one who lived it, delivered through distance, courage, and the refusal to remain silent. And it is also my judgment, spoken as one who has watched power disguise itself as love for centuries. A parent's authority exists to prepare a child for independence, not to hold their future hostage. When reputation becomes a weapon and fear becomes a tool, the relationship is no longer built on care, it is built on control. And control, no matter how quietly it is exercised, is still abuse. The character in this story passed her judgment the moment she chose truth over obedience. She did not seek revenge. She did not demand confession. She simply withdrew her fear. And without fear, the power that once seemed unbreakable collapsed on its own. My judgment is simple and final. Any love that survives only through silence is not love. Any authority that depends on intimidation has already failed, and any bond that requires a person to disappear in order to belong was never meant to be kept. To those who recognize themselves in this story, understand this clearly. You are not disloyal for choosing freedom. You are not weak for walking away. And you are not wrong for refusing to live a life shaped by threats instead of truth. Some judgments are not announced. They are lived. And this one was delivered the moment fear lost its hold. This is my judgment, and this is where the story ends. If stories like this resonate with you, stay. More truths will be judged here.